Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and today we're going to be taking a look at 3 games that are based after the anime series Lupin the Third. And in case you didn't know, I actually talked about this series within my anime feature last year. Well, the original one that was released in 1971 I took a look at, and it was actually pretty enjoyable. And normally I don't like to say what the stuff I'm going to be doing for next year's anime feature, but I will have to tell you one thing, is that yes, I'll be taking a look at the next one that happened right after that, which is called Lupin the Third Part 2. But you're going to have to wait for April, May, or June if you want to watch that one. Now, I'm not going to get too much into what the show is all about, because I've already talked about it before. But the most basic thing that I will have to tell you is that Lupin the Third is a thief. And then you got Inspector Zetagata always chasing him all the time. That's pretty much what it is, and of course you get the other characters too, like Daisuke, Goemon 13, and Fujiko Mine. So now, as for the video games that are based after this series, there's actually quite a few of them, but most of them were only released in Japan. But the very first one that was ever made was actually on the arcade. It was released by Taito. I don't really have much info on it other than that it's an action game, and that one was only released in Japan, so meaning that the only way you can really play it is if you go on MAME and download it. Or if you're very rich, you could just import it from Japan, but I have a feeling that importing an arcade machine from Japan would probably cost a lot of fucking money. But when it comes to arcade games, I just stick to MAME just because it's just so much easier. But there was another arcade game that was released after that one, and this one actually did get a North American release, but it was not called Lupin the Third, it was actually called A Cliffhanger. And no, not the movie that had Sylvester Stallone in it, or even the Super Nintendo game, but was an arcade game that was based after the show, but just renamed to Cliffhanger. And the color scheme of the cabinet all happened to be blue and pink, while it was released in the 80s, so meaning that at least one thing always had to be blue and pink because that's just the way it was back then. So I'm not actually going to take a review of this one, or at least not today, but I will mention it briefly and just say that it was actually an arcade game that used a laser disc, much like Dragon Slayer or Space Ace, meaning it's an interactive movie just like those. Now, I haven't played this one myself, but those games were definitely very unique, especially for the time they were released. So I figured I'd mention that one because I actually found it to be kind of interesting. So finally, let's take a look at the first game. We have to be taking a look at a Famicom game, which is called Lupin the Third: Legacy of Pandora. At least that's what the name translates to. And it was released in 1987, and it was developed by Toes and published by Namco. Now before someone throws a bitch fit at me for mispronouncing Namco, well, their old name actually used to be called Namco. So at the time when this game was released, they went under the name Namco. So anyways, this is an action platformer, and there's not a whole lot I can say about the story. I mean, for one, I don't have a translated version of this game, but from what I looked up, it's really nothing all that special. It's just someone being kidnapped, and then the main gang that happens to be Lupin, Daisuke, and Goemon have to rescue her. Yeah, Fujiko Mine is not in this game whatsoever. When I first played this game, I actually used to think that the girl that was being kidnapped was Fujiko Mine, but just she has shorter hair, but no, that's not the case. But just because this game not having a story is not going to change anything, so whatever, it's not a big deal. It's just something I figured I'd mention. So in this game you can actually choose between the 3 characters that I listed, and they all play slightly differently. So Lupin and Daisuke can both shoot, while Goemon has to use his sword. But Daisuke can actually shoot more times out of his gun, while Lupin can jump higher. So that's kind of interesting that they do play differently. And you can use multiple different types of gadgets, but where you have to find them, I actually had a hard time doing that the first time I was playing this, until I realized that, what the hell are these urinals doing everywhere? So after you break one of the urinal looking things, you actually end up getting some items. So just for some examples, there's the vest, which is probably the most important because it allows you to take an extra hit, because in this game, there's actually one-hit deaths. And then there's a radio, which allows you to switch between characters. And then there's bombs and different types of guns, all that kind of stuff. So this game you really just have to get from one end of the level to the next, and then after when you get inside the house, you actually get to go through doors, avoid some hazards, and even fight a boss at the end. Now that may sound easy, but boy, let me tell you, this game is pretty fucking hard. Now yes, like I said, in this game without the vest, you die in one hit, like no matter what. And when you die with that character, you can't use them until you rescue him out of the house. And once you run out of you guys, it's game over, back to the start. So you really only have 3 lives and that's it. And as far as I know, there's no continue option, meaning that this game is insanely brutal. If it reminds me of anything, it's kind of like the Transformers game that they have on the Famicom, but only difference is that at least this game is not like that insanity. So it's a fairly simple game, but boy is it fucking hard. I know the one thing that probably pisses me off the most is the fact that whenever you're jumping from house to house, you have to go onto the side of the house and he'll like run and jump, but sometimes an enemy will appear right in midair, and it is unavoidable, and yeah, you can't shoot and jump in this game. Unless you're using Goemon, because he can use his sword in the air. But if you're not using him, then you're pretty much fucked. So not only is this game going to test your patience, but it's all about trial and error. So all I have to say left about the gameplay is that it's simple, but fucking hard. So now let's move on to the controls, and all I have to say is that the controls are not too bad. Walking around is easy, shooting is easy, using the objects is pretty easy. Jumping does work pretty well, although one thing I do have a complaint with the jumping is that it can be really hard to get the momentum to jump further, because sometimes when you jump you just won't make it to the other side and then you fall on your face and you die. But other than that, the controls are actually fairly simple, and they are pretty responsive for the most part. But it's nothing that really breaks the game for me, but it definitely does need a little bit of work. Not perfect, but not terrible either. Now as for the game's graphics, I have to say the graphics are actually very nice for 1987. So the characters actually do look really good in 8-bit rendition, so that's very good. It has some bright colors in the background, and the animation on the characters is actually very well done, so with that being said, the graphics are actually very good. Now as for the game's music, all I have to say is that the music is actually pretty good. Now the game doesn't use any of the music from the show, which is a little bit unfortunate, but at least the original music that is in the game actually does sound pretty well done. Now the music that you hear at this part is actually not the original version, but it is the first stage music, but it was done with the sound effects from the Sega Master System, which is kinda cool. Now I'm not saying that there's a Sega Master System version of the game, I'm just saying that someone on the internet actually made a song using the instruments that they used for the Sega Master System sound chip. Just figured I'd mention that because I couldn't find any of the music on YouTube, but I still have to say that the original music in this game when I was playing it was actually pretty good. Now if you want to buy this game, from what I looked up, apparently this game goes from like $8 to $12 for a loose cart, which I think is actually pretty fair, but a complete in box version costs like $70. But thankfully the loose copies are very cheap, and there isn't a lot that I found on eBay, but I'm willing to bet that finding this game around here at a local game store might be very hard to do. Unless you know a store around your area that gets like import games like all the time, and this one happens to be in there, well there's always a possibility. But your best bet is just to order it online, or you know, just play it on an emulator. Whatever works, really. So now, if I were to rate this game, I'm gonna have to give it a 6 out of 10. It's not a bad game, but I definitely can't recommend it to the fans of the series. Mainly because the game just starts out way too hard. Although I definitely don't think this game is as hard as something like the Transformers game or even the Star Wars game that is also on the Famicom, which are probably two of the biggest examples of hard games that are on the Famicom that also happen to be licensed off something. And of course, I don't mind games that are hard, but I found this one, I think it was a little bit on the relentless side, mainly because it just started out that way. And there's plenty of cheap deaths, like I said, when you have an enemy appear right in thin air, I find that to be the most annoying. And the jumping does need a little bit of work, but other than that, this game is actually not bad, it's just very challenging. Although I think that's a bit of an understatement when I said challenging, it's more like fucking ridiculous. But if you really want to have a real life achievement of completing a very hard game, well yeah, I would definitely recommend this one to you. So all I have to say is that it's average, but not bad. Okay, so the next Lupin the Third game we're going to be taking a look at is on Super Famicom, and it's called Lupin the Third: The Legendary Treasure Chase, which was released in 1994, and it was developed and published by Epoch. And obviously this game was only released in Japan. And this time, instead of doing a full-on action game, they decided to do a puzzle/action game. Now as for the story in this one, well, I don't have a translated version of this one either, but from what I've looked up, it's about Lupin, Daisuke, and Goemon just hanging out, and some mysterious looking guy just goes in casually and just says, yeah, Fujiko has been kidnapped, so yeah, you better do something about it, you assholes. So Lupin is just trying to find her, but then eventually he realizes that she is inside this building that is being guarded around by Zenigata's people. So now all he has to do is just sneak into the vents, and there you go, and that's where the game begins. Now, there are cutscenes between certain levels, but because I can't really understand them, I can't really say much, but it just seems like the whole typical thing, though. With Zenigata trying to catch up to Lupin, but then he just trolls the fuck out of him and then escapes, and then there you go. So other than that, I really can't say a whole lot about it. But thankfully, if you didn't know the story in this game, it still doesn't take away from the enjoyment or anything like that, so it's not like the main purpose. So now let's talk about the gameplay. So it's almost like the original one, but this time it's a bit more slow pace. And you don't have to jump on like random rooftops and shit. But you still get like many different types of gadgets, like, you know, you got your gun, you got your bombs, you got a grappling hook this time, and you even got some spring shoes too. And a giant flash bomb which just stuns everything on the screen. So remember when I said this is sort of like a puzzle game? Well, here's the objective, is that on each floor, all you have to do is that you have to try and find a control panel and you punch it, and then after when it breaks, then you can go through the exit and get to the next floor. But the levels are done in an elaborate sort of style, so it makes it sort of like a maze. So you got your usual corridors, you got your vents that you can crawl through, you even got some ladders, and even some doorways that take you to different sections. And as you would suspect, there are many enemies and hazards along the way. So that's all I really have to say about the gameplay. So it's a really simple puzzle/action game, but of course it mostly focuses more on puzzle than action. And just like the first one, this game is still very fucking hard, but I wouldn't say it's as hard as the first game that I already talked about, but it's still pretty tough. But personally, I'd say this one is more fair than the other one. So for now, let's talk about the controls, and I have to say, the controls are actually not too bad this time. Now yes, it is definitely a lot more slower paced, meaning that the jumping is not entirely accurate, but this is not the kind of game that is trying to be like Super Mario Bros. Moving around is really easy, even though you do move pretty slowly, but thankfully there is a run button that you can use. Using your items and switching between items is very easy, so I have to say the controls in this kind of game actually do work pretty well. And like I said before, if this game's control scheme were supposed to be for an actual platformer game, it wouldn't be that great, but this is not what it's trying to be. It's trying to be a puzzle/action game. So for that reason, I actually think it's actually not too bad. Now, as for the game's graphics, well, all I have to say is that the graphics are actually really good. Well, for the intro anyway. Actually, the intro for this game actually looks amazing on Super Nintendo. Just from the way how it's animated, it actually looks pretty damn amazing. So at least the intro definitely does look good, and same thing with the intermission actually looks like the intermission from the show. Now as for the graphics in the game, well, the cutscenes also do look very good, and even the character design of Lupin also does look very good as well. But I do find that some of the backgrounds are a bit on the lacking side, but other than that though, nothing I could really complain about. I mean, graphics don't kill a game for me, honestly. But overall, I'd say that the in-game graphics are not too bad, but they aren't anything amazing, but at least the intro does look fucking cool. Now, as for the music in this game, I have to say it's actually pretty damn good. So not only does the music suit the game very well, but they even have the original theme song, and I have to say it actually sounds really good on Super Nintendo. And some of the songs are pretty damn catchy as well, so I don't have a lot of complaints about the music whatsoever, but it's actually quite good. So at least this game actually does respect the source material as much as it can. Now there is one thing on here that is actually pretty interesting, and I don't know if it would actually work on an emulator, but there's actually additional content within this game that you can access through a separate device. And that happened to be a handheld thing called Barcode Battler 2, which was actually developed by the same people that made this game, Epoch. Now in case you're wondering, what the hell is a Barcode Battler anyway? Well, it's a device that you can actually scan cards that have barcodes on them, and on the Super Famicom you can actually scan certain cards and they do different things. Now I couldn't find any information on what exactly it does, but apparently it does enhance certain gameplay elements. In this game, and a couple others happen to work with this thing. So this thing is almost exactly like an e-reader on the Game Boy Advance, but much older. So that's pretty cool to know. I mean, I never knew about this until I looked it up. So now, if you want to buy this game, I actually only found one copy of it on eBay, unless I just typed it in wrong or something, but what I did found is that this game is going for $27, and that is loose, so I really don't know if this is considered rare or common or uncommon, but all I can say is that I would imagine this one is probably pretty tough to find. I mean, if there's only one, but like I said, I might have just typed it in wrong, but either way though, at least this one playing on emulation works fine. And I am willing to bet that there is a fan-translated version, but I just happen to get like an older file of it, so I don't know. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention is that this game actually does have a continue option where you have to type in a password with using the faces of the different characters in a certain order. So it's short, easy to use, and I don't have any issues with it whatsoever. I mean, at least this game actually has a password system. So now, if I were to rate this one, I'm gonna have to give it a 7 out of 10. So I have to say, this game is actually pretty good. Now, it isn't like the best action puzzle type game out there, but it definitely is pretty good and not broken. And as I said, this game is also very tough. but it is very satisfying when you beat a level. And the game does not feel cheap whatsoever. I mean, there are some parts that do seem a little bit unfair, but it's nothing that's like over the top. And the level design is actually pretty good, even though there are some parts that are really confusing, but I mean, that is the point of making an elaborate level design. And of course, it does respect the source material very well, so with that being said, this is actually a pretty decent game if I say so myself. Even though you can only use one character without the entire game, where the last time you were actually able to use 3 of them, well, it's a good thing in this one they actually made one character work well. Even though the last game wasn't that bad, it was just not great either. But for what this game had to offer, it actually did do it pretty well. It's not like the best thing it ever was, but it's definitely not horrible. So that being said, at least there is one decent Lupin the Third game. And finally, we get to talk about the last game in the Lupin the Third series I'm going to be taking a look at, and that happens to be Lupin the Third: The Treasure of the Sorcerer King, released on the PS2, and it was released in 2004 in North America, and it was being developed by Banpresto and published by Bandai. And interesting enough, not only was this the first game in the series to be released outside Japan, but it was also the last. And apparently in Japan, this game got released twice, and the dates between the two were just weeks, so I really don't know what the point of it was, but in brackets, one of them says, "for the family," so I don't know, maybe they had like a censored version over there? I could not find a lot of info on that, so you never know, it might just be bullshit, but I just figured I'd mention it just in case. So the genre for this game just happens to be a stealth action game, which is something they haven't done yet, or at least out of the ones that I've already talked about. So with Lupin being a master thief, you'd think a stealth game would actually work pretty well. But before I get into that, let's talk about the story first, and there's actually quite a big story here, so I'm not going to explain everything, but I'll give you the basic details. So what Lupin is trying to do this time is that he's trying to steal a whole bunch of antiques, but they're very specific antiques where if you put them together, it actually shows you a path to an even bigger treasure, which was owned by King Rudolph II. So Zenigata is all aware of this, or at least he's aware of the antiques anyway. He doesn't know anything about the whole big treasure thing. So of course he's trying to keep everything under control while Lupin and his gang try and steal it without him even knowing about it. So that's all I really have to say. I mean, there's a whole slew of other things, like there's some stuff about the black market and some guy named Theodore, but I really don't feel like getting into that. So yeah, this game definitely does have a bigger story than any other ones that we've taken a look at. But I guess that's to be expected, considering we just jumped from a Super Famicom game to a PS2 game after all. Now as for the gameplay, well, like I said, it's a stealth action game, and you have to use some different gadgets and different disguises to get through, and you even gotta solve some puzzles every now and then. But in the first level, the puzzles mostly consist of trying to figure out what the password is for the trains. So for the most part, you do mostly play as Lupin, but there are some levels, and I believe there's only 2, where you actually do get an option to play as Jigen or Goemon. And they only play differently because the parts where you use them at, there's more action involved and not so much stealth. And something else you can do is that you can actually pickpocket from the guards, but it's very hard to do. Or at least I'm just not very good at it whatsoever. So okay, just from what I'm telling you, this game seems pretty promising, but let's move on to the controls. And all I have to say is that the controls are not very good at all. Now the walking is alright, but I do find that it does feel a little bit slippery at times. The camera angles are very clunky, and trying to use the weapons feels a little bit unresponsive at times. And while you're in the disguise and trying to get by the guards, I really have no idea what the fuck I'm doing. I mean, sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't. I really have no idea how it works. Same thing with the pickpocketing as well, where there are sometimes I know what I'm doing and sometimes I don't. There's just no continuity to it whatsoever. And the AI on the guards are not very good, but then again, I find in a lot of these games, a lot of the AI for the guards are usually pretty shitty. But this one is just so bad that, like, even if you just turn around a corner, they still won't know you're there. It's like, they're that fucking dumb. But one good thing I will have to say is that at least this game does not have any bad frame rate. Now the button layout is okay, but it definitely does take some time to get used to, so with that being said, yeah, the controls in this game are kinda all over the place. The only way you would really understand the controls is if you played it yourself. Yeah, it's one of those games where you really have to play it yourself to actually understand what the hell I'm talking about, or if you don't, well, this might just come off as nonsense. And it's not the worst controls I've ever seen in a video game, very far from it, but it still isn't very good. Now as for the game's graphics, well, for a PS2 it may not be like the greatest thing ever, but considering that it was supposed to be done in an anime sort of style, I think it does look okay. I mean, at least everything is all bright and colorful for the most part. So it does suit the series and what it was trying to be, so at least that's pretty good. So I don't really have much to say about the graphics, but I guess they're a pass. Now as for the game's music, I have to say the music in this game is actually very good. It mostly consists of jazz music, and while I'm not a huge fan of jazz, but I have to say it actually does suit the game, and it actually does sound pretty good. They even made an entire OST off the album, which is pretty cool, so I have to say the music in this game is actually pretty good. Now as for the game's voice acting, well, this is probably the best part considering that it actually has all the same cast from the show. So it consists of Tony Oliver, Michelle Ruff, Richard Epcar, Dan Lorge, which is the main cast, and then you get some other ones like Kerry Wellgren, Paul St. Peter, and Bob Preppenbrooks. So if I say so myself, that's definitely an awesome cast, and all I have to say is that watching the cutscenes with these voice acting definitely makes it worthwhile, especially if you're playing this when you're a fan of the series. So I can easily say that that's probably the best part. Now, if you want to buy this game is actually very cheap. The cheapest I've ever seen it for was like $5, I've seen it for $6, $8, $9, $10. The most I've ever seen it for was like $14.99, but that very rarely ever happens. So at least this game is very cheap, and I have seen it a couple of times before, so it's also pretty common as well. So I'm pretty sure that you're gonna find it pretty easily. Now, if I were to rate this one, I'd probably have to give it a 5 out of 10. Even though I said a lot of bad things about the gameplay, well, at least it's not terrible, but it's also far from amazing. But it's really just mediocre for the type of game that it's trying to be, which is very unfortunate because you'd think something like this would have worked perfectly. But this game is one of those cases where the gameplay of it is not very good, but everything else about it is actually pretty damn awesome. You know, when it comes to the music, the voice acting, the cutscenes. And that's one thing about this game that does make it worth playing through, is just to see the cutscenes, even though I know you could just watch them on YouTube. But if you just want to experience the gameplay itself with the cutscenes with it, well, it's not a terrible idea, but of course, this game is definitely not going to be for everyone. I mean, even for a fan of the series like myself, I still think the game is just mediocre. And as I said before, something like this actually could have been awesome. But unfortunately, they just didn't happen that way. So with that being said, this is probably the reason why that we never got another Lupin the Third game, because this one was just not that great. There were other ones that did come out, such as one being on the DS, then there was even a GameCube game, there was even other PS2 games, and even another arcade game. And yeah, there are different types of genres of them too, like there is also more puzzle games, there's even a light gun game, and more action games, and believe it or not, there's even a music game called Punch the Monkey. Now, in case you're watching this and you have no idea what that has to do with anything, well, that's because it has to do with the publisher of the Lupin the Third mangas, such as Monkey Punch. So that's where that came from, but still, turning this into a music game, that just seems weird. And maybe eventually I would like to look into the other games, but unfortunately, because they are all in Japan and they're all on systems that are much more advanced, you know, like PS2 and GameCube, but I don't know, maybe because I have a newer PC and I can actually run better games, maybe I could actually do emulation on those. But I'll figure that out when I get there. But as for the series as a whole, from what I've looked at, okay, so we got a Famicom game that was decent but just hard as fuck, and then there was a Super Famicom game that was actually pretty fun, but of course it's also hard as fuck, but definitely pretty rewarding. And then you got the PS2 game that got released over here, and well, it's just very mediocre, but not terrible. So it kinda has a very weird mixture there, but either way, at least the animes are still going strong. So let's end this review. So I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching and commenting.